Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome very much to this Common Futures Conversation webinar on surveillance technologies. We've got a packed agenda today and two wonderful expert speakers to set the scene, and we will then hear from community members with their presentations of ideas, have some feedback from the experts, and then a general Q&A if we get the time. My name is Emily Taylor. I'm an Associate Fellow at the International Security Department in Chatham House and editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. Philip Thigo is Tech Advisor on Data Innovation and Open Government in the Office of the Deputy President of Kenya. He is also Senior Director for Africa at the Thunderbird School of Global Management in Arizona State University. Welcome, Philip. And after hearing from Philip, we will also hear from Caroline Wilson Palow, who is the Legal Director and General Counsel at Privacy International. Or do you say Privacy International, Caroline? One or the other, which is a UK charity which defends and promotes the right to privacy across the world. Welcome to you both. Philip, can I ask you to give your opening remarks? Thank you.
Thank you very much to Chatham House for actually having invited us to have this conversation. I think the conversation on surveillance technologies, I think as a threat to democracy and democratic governance is a timely conversation. I think the context for Africa is very simple. We were overnight thrust into a technologically enhanced world. And for those of us, you know that we still have challenges around technology and connectivity. Our infrastructure is still very weak, especially around accessibility. And so COVID-19 happened. For countries like Kenya, it was in March 11, and it basically meant that we all of a sudden are a form of a restriction or a kind of a lockdown. And so it basically meant that all of a sudden technology then becomes quite pivotal in how we live, how we learn, and how we work. And basically it means that all of a sudden we have to be online and basically transact, whether it's government business, education, business, or trade. And so I think for us, it was very clear that all of a sudden as governments, you kind of have to choose between, do you onboard online and deliver services? Then in most cases, this is what happened to privacy, right? So privacy kind of takes a second kind of role in this. And so basically, this is what I think African governments are grappling with. A health crisis then manifests itself with other challenges that come with it. So you kind of have to pick whether you want to save lives or then look at the other particular issues around privacy. Secondly, as you know, Africans normally are not producers of technology. We are basically users of technology. And so I don't think a lot of governments really had a choice of which technologies to use because we do not produce it. And so it basically means that at the moment, because of the demand of COVID as a location-based pandemic, it means that you have to use location-based technologies. And so in those location-based technologies, it means that location analytics becomes quite critical. It means because of differentiated lockdown, it means those pieces of information that are tied to location and demographic become quite critical to responding to COVID-19. And for those who understand, of course, then when you deploy technology, and in most cases, technology has been deployed without necessarily policies that actually anchor that deployment of technology. Secondly, of course, because of how governments work in silos, of course, this is first a health crisis. And so it means it's the health practitioners who are leading. And so most of them may not be technologically savvy to understand the challenges around that. Secondly, of course, as I say, because of the context of situation we are in, the rugged terrain, the issues around accessibility, it means you have to rely on apps or innovators to build tools. And so a lot of these innovators are running, keeping their heads down, and are not necessarily thinking privacy, and not necessarily thinking security. And so that tells you we have a plethora of contact tracing apps around the continent right now that first is about contact tracing, then of course security becomes a sort of a secondary role. So for me, that's basically the challenge. The challenge I see is basically, of course, around, these are stopgap measures. They do not necessarily, are not necessarily resilient. And so how do we think through this, in the sense that, okay, now that you're deploying this technology and applications, it's going to be very hard to kind of roll back their usage, or to kind of manage their misuse in future, because of course, first of all, it's a pandemic, then everything else is secondary. And so I think for me, in terms of the larger context, that's a problem. We do not produce technologies. Technologies are largely held by private sector. Infrastructure challenges, it means a lot of countries do not have necessarily data centers or capabilities to hold those data sets. The third bit, of course, this interoperability question around data, it means there's a heavy reliance on third-party vendors to sort of support, deploy these technologies. And so I think for me, then when we come back to this conversation of how do we ensure that first, is that we have a robust, agile policy environment that actually enables, yes, deployment of technologies in times of crisis, but also there's a thought or a thinking through around resiliency around these bits. There are examples, I think of what we're seeing emerging around this particular space. In our case, for example, it's been quite critical to quickly build a multi-stakeholder collaborative between local companies, government, civil society, and the big companies, whether it's Facebook or the rest, in terms of building a sort of a more or less of a self-checking mechanism within which then you are helping governments to deploy these technologies. And this is really at national level. At the regional level, especially at the level of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. UN Economic Commission for Africa, again, quickly stepping in and helping countries leverage data, leverage capabilities around technologies, leverage capabilities around quick deployment of infrastructure, so that they then bother with the security and privacy concerns. Of course, the third bit, and this is where the Achilles heel is the policy bit. And there's really not much of an emphasis at the moment, I'll be very honest, around policy. Also because this kind of environments require agile policies. And so there's really a gap there. And if you think through, only 27 African countries have some form of data protection legislation. And so it means that's a challenge, right? And then secondly, only a few of them also again have access to information laws, which means that you really don't have citizens who are empowered to request for information around transparency and accountability. And neither do we have a regime that protects data and privacy. Of course, then I think finally, and this is really what I want to mention, is that as much as we talk about technology, we really are talking about the fourth industrial revolution. And the technologies we're talking about now are quite smart, especially when we talk about artificial intelligence. So whether or not we don't produce them, it means that there are biases in those technologies. When you talk about artificial intelligence, at the moment, for example, when you have a country that is using technology that is AI driven, and you have differentiated lockdowns, nobody is interrogating how that artificial intelligence technology is thinking, or is determining which demography then needs to be locked down or which demography is not, or how is it predicting in terms of the spread of the virus. So, I mean, for me, for example, it would be interesting to have a conversation around algorithmic transparency in terms of how do we understand how algorithms think and make their decisions. And the second bit, of course, we understand algorithmic bias, right? So when you look at the biases around that, then how do we ensure that technologies are safely deployed, responsibly used, but also anchored in an agile policy framework that recognizes that they keep on changing, but then it's also very much centered on delivery of services.
Philip Thigo, thank you very much for those opening remarks. And I could see Caroline nodding quite a bit, particularly in your closing elements around bias in these technologies and the need for algorithmic transparency. But you know, taking the context of Africa, where you are users, not producers, the reliance on the private sector, challenges of connectivity, and the sort of deployment first, ask questions later. And so you've got the basic functionality within an pandemic, then it's like, oh, what do we do about security, and oh, what do we do about privacy or privacy? So can I turn now to you, Caroline Wilson Palow of Privacy International, for your introductory comments. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. And first, thank you very much for inviting me to take part here today. Yeah, I think that Philip is actually really well set up, exactly what I was going to talk about too, because I think that we see a lot of the same trends and a lot of the same problems with defending privacy around the world that Philip has just articulated in Africa. Just to say a little bit first about the work that Privacy International does. We are an international organization. We work with official partners in 20 countries all around the world, and then in many more sort of less formalized relationships with partners in many other countries as well. And of course, as our goal is to defend privacy in all these contexts, we've done quite a lot of work in the last decade in particular on surveillance, both surveillance, government surveillance, and also surveillance being carried out by corporations or facilitated by corporations. And so ultimately what we look for when we're trying to defend against these intrusions of privacy that surveillance represents is we want to see, especially in Europe, which I'm focusing on today, we want to see that any intrusion on privacy is in accordance with law and is necessary and proportionate. So those are fundamentally what we're looking at when new technologies are rolled out. But of course, new surveillance technologies raise a lot of challenges in applying these principles, especially when governments are not that forthcoming about the techniques being used. And that's one of the first challenges, is understanding what new techniques are being used in what context. That's often the first roadblock we have. And as what Philip just described, oftentimes I think new surveillance technology is deployed first because it's new, it's shiny, it seems like a good way to solve a problem, without a thorough conversation about the legal and the policy implications of using this new technology. And we've seen this again and again in a variety of contexts. Talk a little bit about some of the surveillance focus that we've had over the last few years. We've looked at mass surveillance in a variety of different forms, whether it be bulk data retention, bulk interception of communications, bulk collection of communications data, and the application of machine learning and artificial intelligence to all of those contexts, which Philip was alluding to too. We've looked at intelligence sharing and cross-border access to data, which brings in a lot of new challenges too, because you're starting to talk about multiple legal regimes across multiple different countries. And that can be, it's a concern within Europe and all across the world. More and more, a lot of police and intelligence agencies are using hacking as a way to get access to data on our computers and our devices. And that's become so much more acute, that concern, in our current environment, as so many more people are online and essentially conducting their entire lives online in a way that we didn't have to prior to the pandemic. We've of course also been following facial recognition and increasing government surveillance for other types of purposes, like using government surveillance to decide when benefits might be allocated, or who will be allowed to enter a country around migration, or even, as we are seeing right now, how health services will be provided. And that of course has become really acute right now with the COVID-19 surveillance proposals, the various apps that have been on the table, or attempts to use pre-existing surveillance powers that I already talked about, like some of those bulk collection of communications data that will help determine countries analyze where people are located at any particular time, and are really concerned about repurposing of those powers for surveillance in the current context. So first, given that I'm trying to focus a bit more in Europe, I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the legal and political landscape in Europe. Obviously, Europe and the legal and political landscape varies a lot by country. But it also has these overarching regional bodies that we go to very often too when we're challenging unlawful surveillance. And then that reaction and what that landscape looks like has also varied over time. Just to sort of summarize a little bit over the last decade and see how these responses go up and down. You know, we had in 2013, we had Snowden release a lot of the documents where we found out about some surveillance practices, especially in the US and the UK, but it had impact for a number of different European countries. And for a while, we saw quite a lot of concern about privacy and some moves to try to push back on new technologies being deployed, both on the corporate side and from governments. But then by the time we got to 2015, we saw a few more terrorist attacks in Europe, and then it sort of swung the other way, and we saw a lot of governments trying to pass laws and deploy new technology, and even use emergency powers, which we're now seeing again, to intrude more on privacy and maybe, in our view, sort of upend the balance of privacy and the use of this intrusive technology. Then in 2016, 2017, 2018, we perhaps saw a little bit of correction of that at the European level, because we started to see some court judgments come out, and some other legal instruments like GDPR come into effect that were a bit of a reaction to what happened in 2015 as emergency powers were rolled out, and started to give all of us a bit more power to challenge some of the problematic practices. But now, of course, we're in 2020 and we have the COVID-19 response, which has once again causing a whole lot of extra questions, which I think maybe we'll go into a little bit more later when we respond to one of the proposals today around whether or not the surveillance is lawful and effective that's being proposed. This also, like I said, it varies a lot by country. The UK and France, for instance, have quite expanded their surveillance powers in recent times. The Netherlands, Sweden, Italy have also passed new laws, sort of more targeted, sometimes authorizing hacking or authorizing other forms of bulk surveillance. Germany is often thought of as being a little more privacy protective, but they still are seeking new surveillance powers, if in a more constrained way. But then, of course, you also have the EU level. And even though the competence of the EU doesn't explicitly extend to national security and to policing powers, because a lot of coordination has to happen across the EU countries, a lot of those conversations happen at the EU level nonetheless, especially when, say, data retention was a power that actually became an EU directive in order to allow that coordination to happen across the EU. And so we've had some interesting cases coming out of the Court of Justice of the European Union on surveillance powers, and then, of course, having discussions at the Commission and the Parliament level too. And then finally, there's the European Court of Human Rights that deals a lot with all these surveillance powers and is constantly putting out quite interesting judgments and trying to deal with new technologies that come out. Although with both of these courts, the pace at which they're able to deal with new technologies is a bit slower, especially when you think about something like what's happening now in the coronavirus context, where we need to move quite quickly and states want to move quite quickly to roll out new technologies, and courts often struggle, especially these high-level bodies, to react quickly enough to that, which is why it's so important to have that policy discussion at the national level in parliaments and elsewhere, and be open and transparent about what technologies are being deployed. So what are the main challenges that we face in trying to have these discussions? Well, as I've said all along, it's that lack of transparency. It's trying to figure out what's going on. In Europe, we do rely a lot on freedom of information laws. We rely on data subject access requests under GDPR, some of the powers we have. But even that, we often get stymied because national security is often raised as a reason not to provide those transparency in response to those requests. So we also need to look to oversight bodies to try to help us in engaging in really robust oversight. They can ask some of the hard questions we can't necessarily ask, and yet oftentimes oversight bodies remain, especially over the intelligence services, but over the police as well, they can be under-resourced and they're just stretched. They don't necessarily have the technical expertise that they need to engage with these new technologies that are changing so rapidly. They also, as we push very hard for, we would like to see independent and effective independent authorization for new surveillance techniques. And sometimes oversight bodies aren't capable of doing that. They just don't have the bodies to do it. And then finally, you also need an effective form of redress in order to really challenge these powers. And that's where we have sometimes been successful when we couldn't get transparency through a Freedom of Information Act request. For instance, we've been able to go to certain tribunals like the Investigatory Powers Tribunal here in the UK and start litigation, which has led to more transparency and more effective transparency. But there are a lot of challenges to doing that, and not every country has a system that allows those legal challenges to go forward. so dealing with surveillance and making sure that it remains lawful and well regulated is definitely difficult. But that being said, I think we have had some positive judgments, as I said, from the European Court of Human Rights, from the Court of Justice of the European Union over the last few years. They're starting to move us forward. And we also see that governments are taking privacy concerns seriously. And I think that we're really seeing that in the case of the COVID-19 technology that's being considered, because privacy is part of the conversation. It may be exactly as Philip said, that things are happening rapidly. And so sometimes that means some countries are not putting enough of the privacy consideration into what they're doing, but other countries are. And I think that's because this is so public too, this particular deployment of technology. Everyone's aware of it and can see the immediate impact on them. And so I think that there is reason to be optimistic that we can continue to have these conversations about what is necessary as we deploy technology to make it both privacy protective and effective for the law enforcement or other purposes that it's used for. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline and Philip, and also thank you from me for keeping your remarks exactly to time. One of the first times this has ever happened in my moderating career, but I'm very impressed and grateful to you because we're now going to hear from members of the community who have proposed various mechanisms, policy mechanisms in relation to preventing the misuse of surveillance technologies. So first of all, I would like to call on Paula Sturman from the Netherlands to introduce your idea on preventing the misuse of COVID-19 apps. Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you. In the countries where COVID-19 apps are not obligatory for use for all citizens, they're definitely being proposed as the solution to the problem that we're having in this global pandemic. However, at the same time, for them to be useful in those countries, we need people actually to buy in and feel safe enough to use them, which is being a huge problem, which I can see definitely in the Netherlands, that a huge part of the population is very concerned and not willing to participate, which for me calls for a global approach and perhaps under the auspices of the WHO to have one COVID-19 app, or if that technologically is not advisable or possible, have one set of standards and guidelines which could provide a global stamp of approval for apps used nationally, so that people actually feel they can take part in this and that we can see if the use of technology in this instance will actually have a beneficial impact on public health globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. I think we had a discussion before this started about whether to take each of these ideas in turn and come back to our experts or to take them all together, but we're doing very well for time. So I would like to come back to you, Caroline and Philip, for your immediate responses to this suggestion and you know, which Paula has outlined, and also please do feel free to ask any questions for clarification as well if anything was unclear. And Paula, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Are you Paula or Paula? Which do you prefer?
Oh, yeah, but it's okay either way.
Okay. So and please do come back on the feedback or give your responses as you hear the comments. That's exactly what this is intended for. So who would like to go first?
Yes, so I think, and I looked at your written proposal too, Paula, and I think that it is quite a good idea to try to put forward from a centralized place some of the principles that you were suggesting with regard to this app, which is that all app use should be voluntary, it shouldn't be mandated, that there needs to be sufficient transparency to build that trust that is necessary to make these apps effective, and that there should be done with as much anonymity as possible, which is that these apps shouldn't be something that governments are using to collect data that might on the people who are using the apps that might be used for other purposes besides the very narrow health purposes that they are targeted at. I'm talking here particularly, I think what you're thinking about too is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is apps for instance, contact tracing, because there are a lot of different apps being proposed right now, but it seems like contact tracing is the main ones that are going out, although they're also being used for symptom tracking and perhaps most problematically to enforce lockdown. And I think that last one, where it would never not be voluntary anymore, would be a particularly problematic use. As far as having the WHO develop an app, I think that what we're seeing right now is this technology is really tough to deal with. So on the one hand, it might be great to have one overarching app model that was privacy protective that countries could look to as a good standard. At the same time, though, one of the cautions that we've been having around the deployment of these apps generally is that, is this what is really needed in this particular pandemic? Will this help? And that, I think we need to ask the health authorities in each national context, and look at each national context to understand how well the apps could work in the national context. For instance, is there enough mobile phone penetration in a country to actually allow, I think the pickup needs to be at least 60 to 70% of the population in order to make apps effective, these contact tracing apps effective. So, and are the mobile phones in the country, is the technology sophisticated enough on those phones to actually allow that level of pickup? And then also, even once you do that, if you're using Bluetooth or certain similar types of privacy protecting technologies, which are the best way to go, are they really going to be effective? Because they can't be unless the country also has an effective testing regime, for instance. So people who really know whether or not they are sick, because if they don't know they're sick, then you can get a whole lot of false positives on the app, and you can get people dropping off and not effectively using it. And that's, I think, a question overall that I would ask is, which we often ask with regard to the deployment of new technology, is this really the best mechanism for solving the problem we have? Or could we better put resources towards trying to get better testing in place, do more health engagement in country? So on the one hand, I really like the idea of having an overarching standard that people can agree on as privacy protecting, but I would ask all of those questions too.
Philip, thank you very much, Caroline. Philip.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carol. No, I totally agree, Paula. I think the bigger question, and this is something that for those of us who've been especially within the United Nations processes, has been from 2014 when we were talking about a data revolution for sustainable development. There's always the question of standards, and I think Paula is spot on. I think a week ago, the UN Secretary General again launched a roadmap for digital cooperation, right? So again, when you talk about, and it has to be global, and I totally agree. So when I started the conversation, I said, in most cases, the applications that are quite robust or technologies that are quite robust and rugged are not produced in Africa. So we are users. So for me, then it means we really need a global standard, because as much as we have local jurisdictions or policies, we need, at least at a certain international level, a rules of the road kind of good practice around how and I'm saying technologies in general. So I'll come to the app very specific. So I see two things. Yes, there's application environment, which is the technology, and we can vary that whether it's SMS or other channels within which people can access technologies, but also to ensure feedback. But the second bit is the technology infrastructure and the underlying data architecture, and which for me is the biggest deal. In most cases, technologies are not so intrusive. It's the data and the use of that data that for me then requires a standard, but also guidelines. And as I started, if you look at African countries, and this bit I didn't mention is that, at some point you really do not have a choice. When you don't have money, your economy is in trouble right now. So any company that brings in a technology, you take it because they say it's free. So then if you don't have a global standard, a sort of an international guideline within which you can use as a benchmark to say, listen, we'll adopt this, but then we understand the implication of this, then I think it's becoming a challenge. So this is why I totally agree with, really, in terms of international standard guidelines. I think yes, WHO, but other institutions like the International Telecommunications Union, and to go wider, so that we have a multi-stakeholder approach to this that actually protects everybody across the value chain.
Thank you both for your feedback. So there's a general sort of idea, it is really striking that each country, and even within countries, there are fragmented approaches, and with the pandemic, as Paula has highlighted, some sort of international coordinated response from a respected body like the WHO, you can really see the benefits of that. And then open questions, as Caroline said, that technology is tough, and we're seeing even in the United Kingdom that in fact the technology companies are letting the actually dictate or determining the outcome, regardless of what the government may or may not want. Paula, can I ask you for your reactions to what you've heard from our experts, and then we will move to the next speaker.
Yes, thank you. I totally agree that, of course, part of the conversation should be if COVID-19 apps should be the solution. But I think part of the answer to that question is that we can't really know until they are being used, and are being used to a certain that we can see if there is an effect or not. And of course, that's all still dependent on local follow-up in terms of health. But to have that chance, I think we need this one-term approach, whether that be under the WHO or any other body that might be more capable, more appropriate. So yeah, I would like to thank you for your comments, and I think it's very interesting to hear your point of view.
And a clear sort of challenge that everybody, is circulating in all of our conversations is, you have a health emergency, and as Caroline highlighted, there's been a succession of emergencies which have stimulated various actions, and time is exactly the thing you don't have. And as Philip has highlighted as well, if you have something in your hand that works, then that's what you want to go for, and often these questions are not thought of in advance, and part of these conversations, I hope, are to prepare policymakers to address those questions in the future. Now, we had an idea come through from Stephanie from Benin, but I understand she's not on the call right now. What we'll do is we'll keep her slot open until this part of our discussion is closed. But if I may, can I ask Madeline from Romania to describe your idea for a participatory oversight of surveillance technologies. Madeline, welcome to the discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. My proposal is in the area of oversight policy, and it aims to establish a sort of mechanism that can empower the citizens to participate in this supervisory role. Citizens, users, and non-users also. The concept basically calls for a temporary type of inspection committees or missions with participants from selected from a pool aleatory by those responsible of implementing and enforcing actually this proposal if it would be implemented. And it aims practically to have these finding missions, limited in mandate, and to report publicly on the findings. These findings could go in different thematic areas, privacy, misuse, if there have been recent examples, as you know that there have been a lot. And also they could formulate some recommendation to policymakers, even to pursue some types of further investigation on issues that they consider that could be useful. Of course, there are some prerequisites, for example, to manage these multiple jurisdictions. in order to ensure this participation, the participation in these committees could be somehow transnational, but this is more or less this is an important detail, but it defines practically the functionality, and it also matters to have already established a minimum regulation on technology transparency, and of course a functioning justice system in the jurisdictions where this mechanism could be implemented. Briefly, this is it. So practically some ad hoc temporary inspection committees, missions with citizens selected from a pool of different interested ones, depending on jurisdiction.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. Philip, can I ask you for your reaction to what you've heard on this?
Yeah, so this is quite interesting, because then it's taking the sort of participatory approach, but also the sort of notion of open government, right? In terms of how do citizens play an active role in overseeing government, but in this case is overseeing a piece of technology that is being deployed by government. I think I don't really agree with that, but I think there's a couple of things that have to happen. These are conversations that we've been talking within our open government initiative. One is that when you think about surveillance technology, it's actually shrouded under either Secrecy Act or under national security. And so I think there's a larger conversation here, I think, that we must have with Madeleine in terms of which pieces of this are kind of open for citizens to be able to survey. Interesting enough is even beyond the surveillance technology themselves is the budgets or the money that actually goes towards procuring this. The other bits that we've actually seen, and this is why I love the previous idea in terms of sort of an international oversight body, is that a lot of this surveillance technology within themselves are very militaristic in nature, are actually shrouded internationally within a sort of shroud within which means it's very hard to oversee. So my sense is that there's a lot of other subsystems that have to be interrogated, even beyond sort of national or local jurisdictions, around how you can be able to oversee this. Perhaps it's to go a step further, I think, for me, and that's when I was looking at this idea, I was thinking, for example, conversations that people are having around how can a citizen oversee their own data, right? So how do I have power over my own data, so that how can I be able to consent, or to be able to get alerts, or to be able to get notifications when anybody is looking at any piece of my data? And so for me, that I see is the more possible bit when you tie to this. So it means if for example, I am being surveilled by a contact tracing app, I need to be able to get a notification and ask why, right? And then consent. And we know that there are people exploring these one-time password type applications that actually do this. So my sense is this is really a systemic kind of approach to this. Also is to understand what type of these technologies are. Some are very transient, some are permanent, some are legacy, some are behind shrouds of legalese of big companies. So my sense is that there's really a lot of conversations, but also there are other groups or specialized groups like civil society and very specialized civil society organizations that have to be part of this ecosystem, because then citizens, especially when I come to our continent, citizens in most cases are too busy with their own lives, that then to add another piece to monitor then becomes a challenge. So how do we create an ecosystem of transparency and accountability that supports citizens' agency? And because it's surveillance, there are also issues of witness protection. I mean, there's a lot that has to go into this.
Thank you very much. And I think that transitions very well into the EU context, where the GDPR and so on were aiming at empowering citizens over their data. And Caroline, maybe in your remarks you can comment on whether or not that's been effective. Thank you.
Certainly. Yeah, so well, I'll start out first by saying I like this idea a lot for a couple of reasons. One is that it is an attempt to increase that transparency, which Philip just said can be so hard to obtain, especially in a context where national security or criminal investigations are being invoked. But I think we can perhaps, and I think what this idea is getting at is you can draw a little bit of a line between transparency around an overarching technique that is being used used in technology versus its use in a particular instance, in a particular investigation. And I think that there really is room to have more of a dialogue, and this is the second reason I like this proposal, a dialogue with affected communities about these types of surveillance technologies for a whole variety of reasons, including some of the bias that we've already talked about that can happen in these technologies, including the financing, which Philip already mentioned, that there can be a lot of money involved in obtaining these technologies. And I think these sort of councils could have a lot of benefit in that way by surfacing some of those ideas if they were allowed to, if they're allowed to have the information that they would need to effectively assess those questions. They'd also need, of course, to have technical expertise. And that is something that's quite hard to come by, because there are a number of sort of think tanks and other organizations that have tried these citizen council ideas, not obviously directly to the government level, but trying to bring in people. And when you get technical experts in the room who can explain these things on a level where people who are not technical experts can understand them, it can be effective, but it takes a lot of time. And you need, and a lot of commitment from the people who are involved too to do that. So I think that would be a challenge to overcome too, is how can you get that expertise in the room so people fully understand the capability of the technologies that are being considered. But ultimately, I think councils like this would have to be part of a much larger puzzle, which we do start to have here in Europe, which is other forms of transparency, from a freedom of information regime to GDPR, where you can ask for your data. Of course, there are limits on those data subject access and other data rights under GDPR, because there are exemptions in certain circumstances, including when there's law enforcement, ongoing investigation, national security, or even in elections when political parties are using data. A number of countries have put in exemptions around getting that data too. So it's not perfect. And while we've seen more and more people using those data rights, and we've worked with people actually, and then filed complaints when people are able to get their data, especially from corporate actors, and then complain about the way it's being used. It's certainly an important tool, but it's not perfect. And then you need to pair that too with effective regulators and redress, who then take action once you see those problems. And that's perhaps one of the biggest critiques that's happening right now with regard to GDPR in Europe, is that the regulators aren't taking action nearly fast enough.
Thank you. So a lot to chew on, lots of positive reactions, as well as some questions to kind of help develop your thinking. Madeleine, have you got any immediate responses to what you've heard and to that feedback?
Indeed, that there are some improvements that can be made. Actually, a lot of them. The idea basically was mainly to also, it came also from let's say regional or large supranational type of governments to be promoted from this idea. I started mainly so, the second comment could be on the issue of technical expertise, because also I received this comment before. Yes, it is necessary somehow a type of induction for those that are taking part in this events, or basically this. Thank you for your feedback.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Madeleine, for presenting your idea as well. So we are hearing, I'm assuming that Stephanie's still not on the call. So Vladislav, I'm going to move to you to ask you to introduce your idea about developing the digital ombudsman office as a response to potential misuse of surveillance technologies. Please go ahead with your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, the distinguished panel, for the opportunity to come up with this idea to you. So my idea is related, as you rightly mentioned, to the development of the Digital Ombudsman's Office. And the reason that I came up with this idea is primarily because of the understanding that even though we're told a lot about like surveillance technologies from the point of view of state surveillance, we also need to understand that the threats to us are coming not only from state surveillance, but also from surveillance perpetrated by big corporate actors. And what is extremely essential, but rarely spoken about, is also the third-party data brokers. And in order to be able to tackle this triple menace, an entity that will advocate and stand for really pro-consumer privacy laws is required, and an entity that can sue on behalf of the citizens those who may be in non-compliance, but at the same time they are not properly prosecuted by the state yet. And here is where the digital ombudsman may come in very handy, especially in the context where we see that the enforcement of privacy laws, especially in Europe, is becoming more and more serious. That is pertaining primarily to GDPR. And for such an office, in terms of how it would look like, I envisioned it as an office that will have an expanded mandate in order to hold the suspects in misusing the surveillance tech accountable on behalf of the citizens or citizens group, as I said, by having the ability to sue those culprits in courts, as well as being legally mandated to be allowed to lobby for the adoption of the people-friendly legislation that is related to this technology. So to be able to have a tribune in the legislative for that, as well as having the right to opine on the process in the decision-making, also related to the privacy, by the regulatory and executive authorities. In terms of how the mandate of such an institution and the person who will be its head would look like, I imagine it to be elected for one mandate of 5 years without renewal in order to avoid the interest pressure for the sake of re-election. And that election would be conducted by a specially formed oversight board with a broad representation of civil society, academia, and tech industry people, upon which in their turn will also be selected through a transparent competition process. And the board will not have the right to intervene in the ombudsman's activities from the point of view, or from the operational point of view, but will be able to hold him accountable for the violation of the statutes that will regulate the functioning of the office. And in order to assure its proper independence, I think it will be important that those statutes would be adopted by law in Parliament. And obviously, the last but not the least, when it comes to assuring the independence of such an office, would be to make sure that the sources of funding that are coming to it will not make it beholden to certain interests. And as a young economist, I thought it would be a good practice to borrow from the regulators in banking and especially in insurance, where it's very common to use the shares from their income in order to finance their industry associations or regulators that will basically have the character of mandatory payments. And I think it would be a good practice to adopt that tech companies who derive more than a certain threshold of their income from surveillance technologies, they will be asked to invest a small part into this institution. So
seeing some smiles there, Vladislav, at the funding mechanism. Caroline, can I ask you for your comments first, and then we'll go to Philip. Just a sort of time check. It's now 10 minutes to the hour. We are a speaker short, so it's just I'm hoping to have some time for Q&A. So just to let you know, Caroline.
Certainly, I'll be brief. So again, I really like this idea in its attempt to strengthen oversight and redress. I mean, as I said, those are two of our biggest challenges in dealing with surveillance technologies. So I think it is great in that regard. And I think you've done some really good detailed thinking about how you also make an effective independent authority too. I love the funding idea of bringing in independent funding and resources by taxing the companies themselves. The statutory footing for the guidance, that's also really important, so that the there are clear rules, and they've been independent and agreed upon, so they can't be changed quickly if powerful forces decide that they should be otherwise. And then, yeah, just providing another effective avenue for redress for the citizen, going up against some of these entities who are very powerful. And it's very hard for one individual to engage in that sort of battle. I think that's a great idea too. One caution I would have about creating a body that focuses, as you said, mainly on digital harms is that, and this is something that my colleagues, we often talk about how boring we are when we say this, but there are already existing institutions that are trying to do this. And oftentimes, especially when we're thinking about new technology, the impulse is to try to create something new to deal with it too. But we already have, for instance, a lot of data protection authorities that perhaps could use better resources themselves to carry out this type of function. And maybe it would be incorporating a more ombudsman-like idea like you have, which has a lot of good components to it, into a data protection authority to make sure that the authority could further take forward the types of complaints on behalf of individuals, which is exactly what they should be mandated to do right now. But I also think that the more the merrier when it comes to actually having redress in this area. The more parties and the more actors who can to highlight problems and look for solutions, the better. And that's another reason that we have actually been pushing quite hard for collective rights of all sorts. So there wouldn't necessarily just be an ombudsman or the DPA that could take forward complaints, but you might be able to have either collective action by citizens if they're seeing harm, or you could have organizations like Privacy International or others take forward complaints on behalf of a number of individuals and represent them in the course of that. That's something that, while permissible under GDPR, many countries didn't enact the provision that would allow that to happen. We think that is actually holding back some of that redress too. So I would just say that putting this all in context would be my biggest.
Thank you very much. And Philip, yeah, just a minute.
I'll be very quick.
Yeah, very quick.
So no, sorry. No, I totally agree. No, I love this idea. In fact, the framework of ombudsman is amazing. I just love it in that way, because I think a lot of these technology issues that especially are tied around government are to deliver services. And so if you have a body that is looking at administrative justice or maladministration, I think it's amazing. When you talk about, when you're coming to issue of net neutrality, where companies may be limiting some certain bandwidth to some certain areas, it will become amazing. So I think I love this as it is. It also can operationalize other laws and regulations, but also ensure that citizens actually can access either through the courts or through a mediation process. So I know ombudsman are quasi-judicial. Also, you can staff with experts, which means then it's less burden with other agencies. And I love the funding mechanism. Of course, there's already a model on Universal Services Access Fund. Then it could be a way that also ombudsman also tries to create an equal playing ground for people who have data challenges or technology challenges, or companies can be penalized, and then the funds can go towards creating other new data communities. Done.
Thank you very much, and thank you both for keeping your remarks so succinct and to time. Before I come back to you, Vladislav, for your reaction, can I just open up the floor, just to let everybody know I'm opening up the floor for questions and answers. There is actually a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. I can see, Agnes, that you've put something into the chat, and let's come to that. But for anybody wanting to raise a question, please use the Q&A function, and then we can try and work with that. And if not, I'm sure we'll have plenty to speak about with these ideas. So Vladislav, why don't we come back to you for your reaction to those very positive comments. I also had a question, if I may. I love the idea of the funding mechanism. How would you ensure that the Ombudsman retains its sense of independence and is emboldened to make remarks that are not in favour of its funders on occasion? So over to you, please, Vladislav.
Thank you. So first of all, I am very thankful for the feedback you have provided, and I would like to have 2 quick points on Caroline's comments. I understand that there are already existing institutions that can perform these functions, but then also we need to ask ourselves whether they and like the regulations, they are actually ahead of the curve with the technology, and if they stall, then the case for developing something new will be mounting. That's my first point. And second point about the overlap with the Data Protection Authority is that by its nature, at least from my point of view of how I perceive it, I'm not a professional in it, but the Data Protection Authorities, they are more of a sort of a technocratic players in this field. While the introduction of a digital ombudsman institution will allow us to have a more activist institution in this field that will bridge this gap in access to digital justice for ordinary citizens. And regarding your question, Emily, I think that the independence from the financial point of view in this case will be assured by the fact that these payments will be simply automatic and mandatory. Again, as I said, like that's the case in banking and insurance industries. And then like there won't be simply a way to exercise leverage because it will be inevitable condition. Thank you. Thank you very much for your response, and thank you to our panelists for really constructive feedback to all 3 of those ideas. It's really helpful. I've got one question already from Agnes Kigoto. Agnes, if you have access to a microphone, would you like to take the floor?
Hi guys. For me, I was actually wondering, because I foresee danger for travelers when the airports open, because once data might have been shared without their knowledge, and then when you're about to enter some country, you are pushed to the side with no reason, so like you can't access this, you are not allowed because of this and this reason. So I wanted you guys to address this.
Thank you. So you're really raising the issue of potential discrimination against people out of their use of the app, and then they're denied access to services or even into countries as a result of their health status or some other aspect.
Emily,
yes,
sorry for interrupting. I mean, let's say entry to countries when airports open, because an incident happened years back when smallpox was prevalent in some countries, and the travel bans for people from this country. So the whole profiling internationally, for example, if you're from Italy or China, you can't access this country because people are not sure if you guys still have it or not, is something that I forecast happening maybe.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Philip, Caroline, very quick reactions, and then I'm probably going to have to close the session, but just a quick word on that. I think it's a very important issue that Agnes has raised here.
I think for me, and if you remember, there's been a question around immunity certificates, right? That has been going around, that some people will have to be issued to show that they're immune from COVID. I think, and this is, I think, this is the heart of this conversation. The heart of this conversation is that how do you protect personal data so that it's not misused? And that's why for me, I was talking about responsible use of it. Again, it puts this mandate on an international body like WHO or any other person, or even the UN Commission on Human Rights to start thinking about how do you protect personal data so that it's not shared. And when we talk about travel data, already travel data is being shared at the moment. So I think for me, then the safeguard will be how do we ensure that the pieces, these extra pieces, are also not shared as part of your travel information. So I think there's a larger conversation to have around that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just a quick response from you, Caroline.
I would just say that one of the best ways to protect personal data is not to collect it in the first place. And I think that is why we're pushing so hard on, decentralized models for apps and everything else so that it can't be repurposed for these types of purposes. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We're just at the top of the hour, so it just remains for me to thank our wonderful panelists, our experts, Philip Thigo and Caroline Wilson Palow, also to our participants who've come up with these great ideas for policy interventions and the great discussions that we've been able to have. I would just like to let you know that there is another CFC event happening next Thursday, this Thursday at 12 noon on sustainable waste management, and you can register for that through the usual CFC platform. So thank you to our organisers at Chatham House, thank you to our experts, and also to our young people who've put forward their policy interventions on preventing the abuse and misuse of surveillance technologies. Great session, great discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.